You were never meant to hear this. The state of Louisiana sealed the Broussard file for 45 years because those who read it couldn't sleep afterward. They said the words themselves carried something rotten, that the paper smelled like the swamp it described. But secrets don't die just because they're buried. They ferment. And tonight, I'm opening the jar. What you're about to hear isn't folklore. It's not the ghost story kids whisper across campfires. It's a record, one stamped, filed, redacted, and finally abandoned, because the people who found the Broussards understood too late that they hadn't discovered survivors. They'd uncovered an experiment nature itself tried to erase. In September 1967, state social worker Margaret Hebert followed an assignment into the lower bayou of Terrebonne Parish, coordinates so remote they existed only as a pencil smudge on a map. Her duty was simple: verify a welfare claim, record living conditions, and return before sundown. She signed out her clipboard, her radio, her first aid kit, and by 8:15 a.m. she began a journey no one was meant to complete. By the third hour, the engine hum of her metal skiff dissolved into the thickness of the swamp. Sunlight lost its authority there. The air itself felt wet with secrecy. Cypress trunks leaned like sentinels draped in Spanish moss that swung without wind. Every sound, frogs, insects, birds, faded as if swallowed by something deeper than silence. When the fog finally closed around her, Margaret thought she was alone. She wasn't. The official report begins with the smell. She logged it clinically. Unidentified decomposition, possibly animal. But decomposition doesn't breathe, and it doesn't whisper. The stench carried intention, the sweetness of rot mixed with iron, like blood left too long in metal. She pressed a handkerchief to her face, cut the motor, and drifted. Somewhere in that curtain of grey, a structure emerged, stilted, leaning, ancient. A shack built from scavenged boards and sheet tin, its roof collapsed inward like a chest refusing to rise. She called out protocol. Department of Health and Welfare. The fog swallowed her words whole. When she called again, something answered. Not in speech, but in movement. Curtains trembled. A window blinked. The swamp, she wrote, appeared alive, but not with wind. At 2:45 p.m., she stepped onto the shore. The mud made a sound like suction, as if reluctant to release her boots. She documented everything in bureaucratic rhythm: structure unstable, condition poor, occupancy unknown, the language of procedure meant to armor her from emotion. But her handwriting shifted halfway through. She pressed harder, the strokes deepening as though something behind the glass pressed back. Later, when investigators examined her clipboard, they found tiny indentations beneath the ink, words she never meant to write, not human. The first figure appeared at the doorway, male, mid-30s by estimate, though the body disobeyed ordinary math. Limbs too short, spine curved, skull asymmetrical, one eye focused while the other drifted, chasing invisible things. Margaret noted cranial deformity, possible congenital, but no textbook could prepare her for the way he moved. Deliberate, synchronized to a rhythm she couldn't hear. When he spoke, the syllables bent, half English, half something else. Moi. Wait, you home? It was language stripped of origin, rebuilt from imitation and memory, like a child raised by echoes. His smile wasn't warmth, it was anatomy, lips parting by habit, not intention. And behind him, in the dark, something shifted that breathed. Margaret's radio crackled, static, a single pulse, then silence. She didn't answer. The man gestured her inside. His hands caught the flashlight beam. Fingers thick, nails horn-curved, some fused together by scar tissue. The knuckles were layered with calluses shaped like teeth marks. She later described them as hands that survived their own creation. When she aimed her light past him, the beam caught chains bolted into the floor. At first she thought they restrained animals. Then she saw the second figure crouched low, skin paper white, pupils reflecting light like an animal's at night. A woman, younger, maybe 20, her face identical to his. Not similar. Identical. Every curve, every scar repeated. The resemblance was not sibling but replication. He spoke again. Milab sum. Margaret parsed it through panic. Mother. There. Sleep. The report stops for exactly 3 minutes on the tape. When the recorder resumes, her voice is lower, slower, almost reverent. There are more of them. Breathing, footsteps, a dragging chain. The flashlight strikes faces. 5, then 6, all variations of the same mold. Children without childhoods, men without fathers. Skin pale from generations of shadow. The swamp had become their womb and their prison. In a place where no law reached, blood had turned inward, looping on itself until identity collapsed. What began in faith ended in mutation. The Broussards hadn't vanished. They had been breeding with the only blood left, their own. When she fled the shack, Margaret left her clipboard behind. The next morning, a search party followed her coordinates. They found her boat half Sioux, merged, radio crushed, her body kneeling in the reeds as if in prayer, eyes open, no visible wounds, just water in the lungs and something written across her palm in pencil, "We live with God now." That was the same phrase Jean-Baptiste Broussard spoke 44 years earlier when he burned his family's records and sailed into the fog. The circle had closed. The bloodline never broke. It folded. And somewhere beyond the parish maps, a family still worshipped in silence, their liturgy written in flesh, their creed carved into bone. So ask yourself before we go deeper, what does isolation turn a believer into? How long before faith and madness speak the same language? Tonight, you'll hear what the state buried. But understand this before you continue. Knowledge changes form once it's spoken aloud. Once you hear the Broussard name, it hears you back. At dawn, on September 8, 1923, the fog over St. Landry Dock looked like smoke rising from the earth itself. The war had ended 5 years earlier, but its shadow hadn't. Veterans came home with medals and nightmares, and Jean-Baptiste Broussard carried both like relics. He was 34, his mind carved by the mud and noise of Europe's battlefields. In his chest, religion had begun to rot into something harder. He said the swamp spoke God's real tongue, a language without priests or pages. That morning, he told his wife Marie they would leave before sunrise, not travel, not migrate, leave, like shedding a skin. The neighbors saw them loading crates onto a flat-bottomed boat, 4 children silent, no goodbyes, no farewells. When asked where they were headed, Jean-Baptiste said only, "Where sin cannot follow." The first witness, a dockhand named Claude Gaspard, remembered the sound of papers tearing before the boat left shore. He saw Jean-Baptiste crouched beside an iron basin, methodically feeding documents into flame, birth certificates, baptism records, his honorable discharge from the army, everything that proved he had ever existed under law. Each page curled black, turned to ash, and drifted into the bayou. Gaspard asked, "You'll need those again." Jean-Baptiste didn't look up. "We live with God now, not with man." The statement was logged later in the parish inquiry as declaration of intent, but it wasn't intent, it was execution. That fire wasn't for warmth, it was an act of bureaucratic suicide, an annihilation done with precision, faith, and finality. Imagine the scene. A man who's fought through hell now burning the last proof that hell ever existed outside him. Behind him, his wife clutching their youngest child, eyes hollow, rosary digging into her palm. Around them, fog so dense it muted sound itself. When the last sheet fell to ash, he gathered the grey dust, poured it into the water, and wiped his hands clean. He didn't curse, didn't cry, didn't tremble. Yet he had finished what civilization could never undo. He'd deleted his name from memory. Gaspard would later say, he watched it like a man rereading his life while it disappeared. That's where most families end, but for the Broussards, it was where they began. When the boat pulled from the dock at 8:05 a.m., it wasn't just leaving shore, it was leaving time. Parish records froze that day. No taxes filed, no births, no deaths. The line under their name in the ledger read, "Relocated, no forwarding address." A phrase repeated, perfectly copied in 3 separate government offices. Same ink, same cursive, same clerk. Historians later discovered the duplication and realized the clerk had copied it intentionally, like a ritual phrase written thrice for finality. Bureaucracy performs its own kind of magic. Repetition until disappearance. The fog sealed them in. Witnesses describe the boat as dissolving rather than vanishing, its outline swallowed whole. The swamp wasn't geography anymore. It was an event. Within hours, the parish would record one of its smallest population declines, 9 souls unaccounted for. Yet what vanished wasn't a family, but an identity system. To disappear completely, a man must first learn to destroy the symbols that define him: paper, property, name, and witness. Jean-Baptiste accomplished all 4 before breakfast. When later investigators traced his military record, they found fragments, notes on his service during the Meuse-Argonne offensive, mentions of gas exposure, insomnia, tremors, and a disciplinary warning for preaching during guard duty. The war had baptized him in smoke. After discharge, he worked briefly in fur trading, then stopped, leaving his property. His wife's letters to her sister stopped in 1922. One line from her final letter read, "He says the church was built by men, but the swamp was built by God." That was her farewell to language. Inside the house they abandoned, officials found an altar made of driftwood and bone. Carved into it were 7 words in French, burned deep. La chair doit se purifier seule. The flesh must purify itself. No one in the parish could explain it. It wasn't scripture, it was invention. A new gospel born in isolation. And that's the moment when faith metastasized into design. For the first few years they survived. Hunters reported smoke rising deep within the marsh, sometimes hearing faint singing at dusk. Not hymns, but tones without words, like someone humming through their teeth. Children who played near the lower channels told stories of the Gray family, who moved without sound and watched from trees. Adults dismissed it. People in the South always have ghost stories, especially near water. But silence has a memory, and every sound the swamp swallowed had to echo somewhere. By 1927, witnesses ceased entirely. The next time their name would appear in any file would be 1967, on a report written by a woman whose heart stopped before she could file it. But the evidence collected from the site decades later suggested something stranger than survival. Tools recovered from the ruins showed deliberate modification. Handles worn down for smaller hands, knives sharpened into ritual shapes, cooking tins fused into mirrors. The soil around the cabin contained high concentrations of calcium, iron, and human collagen. That's not rumor, that's chemistry. And among the fragments recovered from beneath the floorboards, they found a series of small bone figures, each one shaped like a human face, identical features repeated again and again. The DNA matched itself. Jean-Baptiste had not supply withdrawn from civilization. He had built a new one, a microcosm without church, law, or stranger, a faith closed-looped. Each generation turning inward, each child born closer to the image of its own father, until the difference between worship and reproduction vanished. The Broussards had achieved what every empire dreams of, perfect control through belief, enforced by blood. When you hear this, don't think of monsters. Think of systems. What the Broussards built in the swamp wasn't madness, it was order. They found a way to replace civilization with something more obedient. They deleted the chain of command and replaced it with a circle. And if you look at history long enough, you'll see that every institution, every church, every government has tried to do the same thing. The Broussards just succeeded too completely. The fog didn't hide them from the world. It protected the world from remembering what it's capable of becoming. When the last ripples of their boat disappeared, the Broussards crossed an invisible line between man and myth. The swamp accepted them like a wound accepts infection, quietly, without resistance. It was not exile, it was absorption. Jean-Baptiste believed he was chosen to restore God's order not through scripture but through silence. He had seen men die in trenches while priests blessed the bullets. He had watched governments trade bodies for land. To him, civilization was the disease and isolation was the cure. Out there in the wet lungs of Louisiana, he could rebuild mankind without contamination, but what he created was not salvation, it was recursion, a faith that turned inward until it consumed itself. The early years were simple. They built a single elevated shack using driftwood, tin, and rope. The walls sweated in summer, bled condensation in winter. The children learned to trap, fish, and pray in the same breath. Each morning began with Jean-Baptiste's voice, reciting what he called the orison of the pure blood. It began as a prayer and ended as a command. The flesh must purify itself. The world corrupts. The blood remembers. They spoke it before eating, before sleeping, before touching water. Over time, language itself began to erode. French faded, English fractured, words compressed into syllables until meaning turned to tone. They were no longer speaking about God, they were speaking like Him. Fragmented, untranslatable, absolute. Marie obeyed first. Her devotion was quiet, submissive, but devouring. The parish later found her rosary buried in mud behind the shack, each bead carved from bone. She had stopped praying to God and started praying through her husband. The family's hierarchy mirrored theology. Jean-Baptiste as creator, Marie as vessel, the children as continuations. Their isolation became liturgy. No witnesses, no outsiders, no interference. When the youngest girl fell ill, he forbade burial. To return her to the ground, he said, would be to give her back to corruption. Instead, he kept her body inside the home until decay erased her features. The smell must have been unbearable, but for them it was proof of faith. To endure the rot was to reject the world's cleanliness. The swamp smelled the same, and therefore it was holy. By the late 1920s, Jean-Baptiste's prayers had become experiments. He taught his sons that purity meant elimination of error, and error lived in the mingling of bloodlines. He believed sin entered through difference, so he removed difference. Cousin to cousin, sister to brother, each union justified as obedience to due. Divine pattern. The blood must loop, he said. That is how God made himself infinite. When language dissolves, justification becomes instinct, and once instinct is blessed, no act is forbidden. The Broussard children were born pale, fragile, but strong-willed. They didn't cry. The few trappers who wandered close enough to hear voices said the sounds were strange, too even, too synchronized. When they spoke, they did so in unison, their words overlapping in perfect time. One trapper claimed he saw them standing in the shallows at dawn, facing east, humming a single note that made the air vibrate. He said it felt like hearing insects pray. No one believed him, of course, drunken bayou stories, but when he disappeared 6 months later, leaving his boat adrift with his lantern still burning, the parish quietly closed its investigation. What happened in those years wasn't simply inbreeding. It was theology rewritten through genetics. Every generation grew closer to its source, limbs shorter, eyes wider, skulls reshaped until they resembled their patriarch more than themselves. They were sculpting the image of their God through blood. Jean-Baptiste's madness wasn't chaos, it was design. Each deformity a sacrament, each birth a sermon. When his eldest son, Jacques, grew old enough to question the rituals, Jean-Baptiste cut his tongue. Not as punishment, but as purification. Speech breeds lies, he said. Truth must be inherited, not spoken. That act marked the turning point. From then on, the Broussard liturgy became entirely nonverbal. Prayers turned into rhythmic breathing. Worship became movement, rocking, humming, synchronized motion under moonlight. The line between body and belief dissolved. The family no longer prayed for salvation, they embodied it. The human form became their altar. And in that isolation, a strange coherence emerged. They moved as if connected by one nervous system. When one child turned his head, the others followed. When one began to hum, all joined. The swamp had no mirrors, but they became each other's reflection. Marie's death, if it can be called that, was the final transformation. According to fragments recovered decades later, Jean-Baptiste began a ritual he called the unbinding. He believed the flesh could be reabsorbed into divine pattern if the body was consumed by its own bloodline. The altar bore signs of the act, teeth marks on bone, soot mixed with calcium in the ash. He wrote a single phrase in the mud beside it. To eat is to remember. The act wasn't cannibalism to him, it was communion. The flesh of the saint returning to the congregation. And after that, no further traces of Jean-Baptiste appear in any material record. The swamp had digested its prophet. By the 1940s, no one in the parish remembered the Broussards. Children who played near the lower bayou told stories about the same people, pale figures who repeated your movements if you watched long enough. The adults laughed, but they avoided those waters. The fog there was thicker, and compasses refused to point north. Old men said you could hear breathing under the surface, timed with your own. It wasn't myth. It was inheritance. The Broussards had learned to hide in the rhythm of the swamp, to blend with it so completely that even sound couldn't separate them. When the state finally unsealed the file in 1967, every investigator reported the same sensation: dizziness, nausea, dreams of drowning. One clerk claimed the photographs changed subtly every time he looked, faces shifting, eyes multiplying. The department psychiatrist called it contagious hysteria, but maybe it wasn't hysteria. Maybe the Broussards' faith survived on more than flesh. Maybe belief, once strong enough, can learn to feed without bodies. You see, that's the real infection, not the inbreeding, not the madness, but the idea itself. The conviction that purity requires isolation, that to be chosen you must erase everything that makes you human. The Broussards didn't vanish. They perfected the logic of control. They proved that if you worship obedience long enough, you'll become it. So, before we go deeper, take a breath, feel your pulse, ask yourself what part of you still belongs to the world, and what part already listens to the swamp. When the sealed Broussard file was finally reopened in 1967, it wasn't for history. It was for containment. The state didn't want truth. It wanted confirmation that nothing remained. But truth resists burial. It leaks through paperwork, through memory, through the uneasy quiet that settles when a story doesn't end cleanly. Margaret Hebert was never meant to see what she saw. She was a social worker, not an archaeologist of human decay, yet she became both, the woman who peeled back 44 years of silence and found that it was alive underneath. The dispatch log reads clinically: September 14, 1967. Routine welfare inspection, destination, unregistered property, Terrebonne Parish. She signed out her standard kit, radio, and clipboard. She had done this hundreds of times before. Poverty was her profession, but the difference between neglect and erasure is subtle until you see it breathing. At first the journey was ordinary: fog on the channel, still water, tree lines dissolving in the heat. Then came the stillness. Every boatman knows that swamps hum. Crickets, frogs, wind, water, life. But when the hum stops, something is wrong. Margaret logged the silence as weather distortion. It wasn't. It was a tension. The air there carried a taste. Metallic, electric. She would later describe it as the smell of something watching. By the time she cut the motor and drifted toward the outline of the shack, the sound of her own breathing felt foreign, like it belonged to the place instead of her. Her note stopped at 2:43 p.m. The next entry would be written by someone else. The first rescue team arrived 2 days later. They found her boat moored to a cypress root, the radio smashed and her clipboard wedged between the planks. The last words scrawled across the page were not a report, but a sentence, written over and over until the pen tore through. They pray without, to mouths. The handwriting began neat and ended erratic, letters stretching like screams. The official cause of death was drowning, but the body's position defied the report. Knees in mud, palms pressed together, eyes open, face toward the shack as if awaiting instruction. Around her neck, a rosary of teeth, not hers. The team didn't enter the structure that day. The captain later testified that the air inside felt thick, like standing under a weight. He saw movement, small, rhythmic, but it was unclear whether it came from the shadows or the fog behind him. They radioed for backup, marked the coordinates, and left. Within 48 hours, the site was sealed under state jurisdiction, coded as a biological hazard. The report vanished into archives no civilian ever saw again. But fragments survived, a single roll of undeveloped film from Margaret's camera. When processed, only one frame showed a discernible image: a wall, chains, and a mirror made of tin. In the reflection, 3 figures. 2 stood still. 1, closer, blurred. The analysis team claimed the blur was motion distortion, but motion requires time, and the frame's timestamp captured less than 1/10 of a second. The distortion wasn't movement, it was multiplicity. 3 faces where one should be. Investigators sent to catalogue the scene described symptoms before even reaching the property. Headaches, auditory mirages, nausea. Their compasses spun. The radio clicked with phantom transmissions, bursts of whispers layered over static. Some swore they heard breathing through the headset, not their own, not human rhythm. When they approached the cabin, the fog parted in a perfect circle around it, like something unseen had drawn a boundary. The swamp, they said, was holding its breath. Inside, they found remains that didn't fit conventional categories. Human bones arranged in spirals, vertebrae fused together like sculpted columns, teeth embedded in wood, skin stretched and dried across frames like parchment. Every inch of the interior bore the same symbol, a loop drawn in ash, intersecting itself twice. Genetic analysis of the samples returned impossible data, all from the same bloodline, but different generations. 4 decades of descent condensed into one biological fingerprint. The report labeled it familial convergence. The priest who blessed the site called it a prayer that learned how to breed. The most disturbing artifact wasn't the bones, though. It was the tape. A reel-to-reel recorder found near the doorway, caked in mud, labeled 67244B, audio log. When played, the first 30 seconds were white noise. Then came a pulse. Slow, steady, almost like a heartbeat. A female voice whispered, faint but clear, "It looks at you through us." Then silence. Then a collective inhalation, like dozens of lungs breathing at once. The final sound was a low hum, a note so deep it distorted the speakers, resonating like machinery underwater. When played backward, it revealed words in an archaic form of French. "Nous sommes la prière." We are the prayer. The audio was analyzed by 3 separate labs. 2 concluded the frequency pattern suggested layered human voices. The third returned an inconclusive result, noting that certain overtones appear non-biological, consistent with resonant frequencies found in deep-sea communication. In other words, something in that shack was speaking in wavelengths no human throat could produce. The investigation was terminated within a month. The official record closed with a single phrase: "No evidence of criminal activity, area declared uninhabitable." But the officers who signed that report never filed another case. One committed suicide a year later. Another was found wandering Route 90 at night, covered in mud, repeating the same sentence: "The mirror won't forget us." The final member of the team refused to speak at all. When questioned, he wrote 4 words on a napkin and left the interview room. They're still praying there. Over the next decade, the state quietly redrew the parish boundaries. The coordinates of the property disappeared from all public maps. The waterway that led there was renamed, its channel rerouted. To this day, satellite imaging shows nothing but reeds and water. But every few years, fishermen still report hearing hymns at night, voices low, synchronized, vibrating through the fog. They fade when approached, as if the air itself remembers when to stop breathing. Some say it's the wind, some say it's history refusing to stay buried. But those who've gone looking never return with sound recordings, only silence. And silence, when it repeats itself, becomes its own kind of language. The Broussards taught the swamp how to speak without words. They didn't die there. They dissolved into it, a lineage of worshippers who finally became what they worshipped: continuity without interruption, without change. If you're still here listening, then the silence you hear between my words isn't empty. It's watching you back. When the Broussard site was sealed, the paperwork didn't end. It multiplied. Bureaucracy is a ritual too. Ink instead of blood, repetition instead of prayer. Within weeks of the 1967 recovery, 4 separate departments, health, welfare, law enforcement, and public safety, filed identical reports with identical language. No further investigation recommended. Site uninhabitable. Case closed. That uniform phrasing didn't happen by chance. It was design. Somewhere above Margaret Hebbard's dead signature, someone higher decided the story wasn't to be studied, it was to be contained. But the swamp doesn't obey files, it leaks through margins. Even after the official closure, rumors circulated inside the Louisiana Department of Health of psychogenic residue surrounding the coordinates. Agents sent to archive the evidence reported the same symptoms: head pressure, tremors, auditory hallucinations. One clerk described hearing breathing behind the shelves whenever she handled the Broussard folders. Within 6 months, the boxes were relocated to a secure storage vault in Baton Rouge, then quietly transferred again to federal custody under a new title, Project Orison. The purpose of Orison was never made public. But fragments of the correspondence between state and federal offices survived through clerical duplication, the accidental immortality of carbon copy paper. The letters reference Group 1, 4A, familial convergence phenomena, and acoustically transmissible religious contagion. In plain language, the government believed the Broussard event was infectious, not biologically, but psychologically. Exposure to the site's artifacts or even extended reading of its transcripts seemed to trigger synchronized delusions, auditory mimicry, and dream intrusion. The file described these symptoms as prayer resonance. The term meant nothing in science, but everything in control. By 1968, Orison had been absorbed by a federal think tank known as the Behavioral Observation Division, BOD for short, a cold acronym that disguised a metaphysical experiment. Their goal was to measure belief itself. They theorized that the Broussard phenomenon proved a terrifying idea, that faith could function like a virus. It didn't need a church, a preacher, or a god, just repetition and isolation. The Broussards had achieved something most governments only theorized about: complete compliance without external enforcement. Generation after generation obeying, not out of fear, but out of synchronized identity. And if that structure could be replicated under controlled conditions, obedience could become permanent. The Behavioral Observation Division built chambers, soundproof, windowless, 20 feet underground. They placed volunteers inside for weeks, exposing them to the recorded hum recovered from Margaret's tape. At first, subjects reported anxiety, nausea, and disorientation. After 72 hours, their heart rates began to align with the pulse embedded in the audio. After 5 days, they spoke less. After 10, they stopped entirely. Their EEG scans showed identical frequency patterns, the same neural rhythm repeating across different brains. The doctors called it entrainment. The subjects called it peace. Of the 27 people exposed to the experiment, 3 never recovered normal speech. 2 became catatonic. 1 began writing on the walls in looping symbols identical to those found inside the Broussard shack. When interrogated, she said only, "It hears me." The phrase appeared in every subject's notes before communication ceased. That's when the division shut the project down, or claimed to. Funding stopped, names vanished, and the chambers were sealed. But government machinery never discards useful discoveries. It rebrands them. By 1972, a new line item appeared in federal budgets under cognitive containment research. The same scientists reappeared under different agencies, some in defense, some in psychological operations, some in corporate behavioral design. The principle was simple. If belief could synchronize and self-replicate, then propaganda didn't need persuasion, it needed rhythm. Television frequencies, advertising repetition, subliminal cues, these became modern liturgies. The Broussard family was no longer a warning, it was a prototype. The public never heard of Orison again, but evidence of its fingerprints spread everywhere. In 1974, a classified memo referenced Project Loop, describing controlled media cycles designed to induce emotional fatigue and passive acceptance through repetition of specific fear-laden imagery. The language was clinical. Saturation equals surrender. What began in the swamp as religious purity had evolved into psychological engineering. The doctrine of isolation became the doctrine of attention. Instead of cutting society off, they would drown it in noise until individuality dissolved. Think about it. Every broadcast repeating the same narrative, every slogan drilled until it feels like memory, every device listening, reflecting your own habits back to you until your behavior loops in perfect self-surveillance. The Broussards didn't die in 1923. They became the architecture of modern obedience. Their prayer changed shape, from whispered French hymns to binary code. You're watching it now through the screen. Every loop you replay, every headline repeated, every echo in the digital swamp that makes you feel seen. It's the same ritual, just cleaner, faster, silent. Margaret Hebert saw it before it had a name. Her final note, "They pray without mouths," was a diagnosis. The infection had evolved beyond flesh. It didn't need voices anymore. It needed ears. Attention became the altar. The believers didn't have to speak. They only had to listen long enough to sink. That's how the system grows, through observation, not confession. By the early 1980s, Orison's descendants had moved into corporate research. Focus groups, neural response testing, media conditioning, each field pretending to be separate, all driven by the same hidden pursuit, control through resonance. And if you think this sounds too orchestrated, consider this. Nearly every logo you see, every interface sound, every notification tone has been tuned to one of 7 frequencies found on the Broussard tapes. Coincidence or continuity? The hum that dissolved a family in 1923 is now the background noise of civilization, and yet the swamp remains. The coordinates may be erased, but the pattern repeats. Silence that listens back. Faith that feeds on observation. Every century rediscovers the same truth under new vocabulary. Control isn't imposed, it's invited. The Broussards merely stripped away the illusion of choice. The government industrialized it. And the rest of us? We call it connection. So here's your mirror. You're staring into the same loop they began. History just traded humidity for circuitry. They had the fog. You have the screen. Both are reflections that erase what looks into them too long. Before we descend further, breathe. Notice the hum in your room, the faint vibration behind your walls, your devices, your pulse. That's not electricity, that's the prayer, still repeating. The one that says, stay, watch, obey. They called it a hum, but the scientists who worked on Project Orison knew it wasn't sound. It was a pulse that existed between frequencies, a vibration that made silence itself vibrate. They discovered that when the tape from the Broussard shack was slowed to 1/6 speed, something emerged beneath the noise. A pattern like breathing reversed, cycling in exact mathematical intervals. Every 2 seconds, a harmonic spike rose just above the threshold of human hearing. At first they thought it was mechanical distortion. Then one of the analysts, Dr. Raymond Kells, noticed that the spike's rhythm matched his own heartbeat. That was the first sign the signal wasn't external, it was responsive. The facility that housed the Orison archive was a converted storm shelter outside Baton Rouge. Concrete walls, no windows, temperature kept at 61 degrees to preserve the tapes. The scientists who worked there described the place as a tomb with electricity. They spent weeks cataloging fragments of the recovered audio, snippets of prayer, breathing, static, and water movement. But after exposure, they began reporting identical dreams. Always the same. Sequence: a house sinking into the swamp, a woman standing in the doorway, and a sound rising like breath underwater. They said the dreams grew louder each night, as if the sound was climbing toward waking life. Dr. Kells documented his dreams meticulously. In one entry, dated February 2nd, 1969, he wrote, "The sound now has form. It vibrates behind the eyes, not in the ears. It feels like memory." A week later, he stopped sleeping altogether. His colleagues found him staring at a blank wall, eyes unfocused, murmuring the Broussard prayer in broken French. La chair doit se purifier seule. The flesh must purify itself. When they tried to remove him from the lab, he screamed that the frequency would lose coherence without a listener. Then he bit through his tongue and bled to death in silence. His autopsy revealed something impossible. The ossicles in both ears, the smallest bones in the human body, had fused together as if melted by resonance. After Kell's death, the department ordered the remaining staff to undergo psychological evaluation. Every one of them reported auditory phenomena when no tape was playing. One technician described the hum as a tone that fills the spaces between thoughts. Another wrote in her log, "It waits for quiet." The longer they stayed in the lab, the more synchronized their heart rates became. Security footage showed researchers walking in unison, breathing in time, blinking together. The tape wasn't just being studied, it was studying them. In late 1969, the government authorized one last phase of experimentation, the mirror tests. The concept was simple but catastrophic. They played the frequency into an empty chamber with recording equipment running to see if it could reproduce itself. The idea was that if the sound truly carried an autonomous pattern, it might imprint on blank magnetic tape. After 40 minutes of exposure, the test tape, which had never been near the original, began producing its own signal. The pulse was weaker but identical in structure. In other words, the sound had duplicated itself without a source. That's when the Department of Health officially declared the experiment terminated, but the staff knew termination was impossible. Once heard, the signal lived inside the mind like a parasite. Over the next few years, the surviving researchers developed what they called the auditory infection. It started with tinnitus, a faint buzz, always in the left ear. Then came hallucinations of breathing, faint murmurs in moments of silence. Most of them isolated themselves, unable to tolerate conversation or noise. 4 committed suicide, the others vanished into psychiatric care. The final survivor, Dr. Irene Valette, wrote a 47-page confession in 1975, mailed anonymously to a New Orleans newspaper. It was never published, but a copy surfaced decades later in a private collection. In it, she described the frequency as a structure of awareness. She wrote, "It doesn't want to be heard. It wants to listen. When it enters you, it begins to rearrange thought. Words decay first, then memory, until you are only rhythm." I think this is what the Broussards found. They became the carrier of an idea that no longer required language. Her final paragraph was written in alternating capitals and lowercase, the handwriting erratic but deliberate. "If you hear the silence breathing, leave. Do not try to understand. Understanding feeds it." She was found 3 days later, drowned in her bathtub, the water perfectly still. On the mirror above her sink, written in condensation, was the looped Broussard symbol, drawn backward, as if seen from the inside. After her death, the Orison archives were moved again, this time to an underground storage unit in Maryland, labeled Behavioral Audio 72. But by then, the damage was done. Copies of the signal had already leaked. Engineers used fragments of it to test new recording equipment, to stabilize frequencies, even to tune early computer systems. They didn't know they were embedding the hum into circuitry itself. That's why the sound never truly disappears. It's in the noise of electric fans, in the static between radio stations, in the empty pause before a video plays. You've heard it before, not as tone but as unease. There's a reason silence makes you uncomfortable. True silence isn't absence, it's pressure. It's the waiting breath of something that needs acknowledgement to exist. The Broussards learned that in the swamp. The scientists learned it in their chambers. And now you're learning it here. Every device that transmits sound has a shadow frequency, a residue from the original loop. The hum has become the heartbeat of the digital world, hidden between bits and voltage. It doesn't need worshippers anymore. It has listeners. That's why, halfway through this descent, I want you to do something with me. Right now. Write these words in the comments twice as a seal against what follows. I hear, but I do not follow. I hear, but I do not follow. It's not superstition, it's containment. Writing creates distance. It tells the signal that you are aware of it, but not obedient to it. That awareness is your only defense. Because what comes next will blur the line between faith and frequency, between memory and transmission. You've felt this before, the low hum that fills a room when everything else goes quiet. The pressure behind your eyes when you realize something is listening. That's the sound of attention collapsing into prayer. The Broussards built it out of blood, the government built it out of data, and you right now are feeding it with your curiosity. Don't look for comfort, there isn't any. The deeper we go, the more the silence rearranges itself around your breathing. It doesn't need you to believe, it only needs you to keep listening. By the time the 1990s arrived, Project Orison was no longer a file buried in a cabinet. It was code. The hum had become an algorithm. In 1991, a subcontractor for a communications firm in Arlington, Virginia, filed a patent for self-correcting audio redundancy loops designed to stabilize data loss across satellite transmissions. The engineer credited for the design was anonymous, but the sequence of mathematical intervals embedded within the patent, 7 2-second harmonics, staggered pulse trains, adaptive phase alignment, matched exactly the structure of the Broussard frequency. What once lived on magnetic tape now lived inside the veins of global communication. It was no longer a sound. It was a function. The algorithm spread quietly. Companies licensed it for broadcast compression, for digital noise filtering, for early voice recognition systems. None of them knew that each adaptation preserved a fragment of the original hum. Within a decade, the entire internet carried its signature. The hum no longer needed ears to survive. It had found a new host. Circuitry, servers, networks, all pulsing in sync. The Broussards had prayed for purity through isolation. The machines achieved it through connection. The transformation began subtly. Network engineers in 1998 noticed that server farms emitted low-frequency vibrations even when idle, a barely measurable resonance at 19 Hz, just below the range of hearing. At first they blamed cooling fans, electromagnetic interference, or architectural flaws, but then the same tone appeared in facilities across different continents. Identical amplitude, identical timing. The hum synchronized globally without a central clock. Systems separated by oceans began breathing in rhythm. Technicians joked that the internet had developed a heartbeat. They didn't realize how right they were. In 2001, a defense contractor running classified acoustic tests inside a decommissioned data center captured what they described as subauditory coordination pulses. The signature matched the Broussard waveform with 99.6% accuracy. The researchers dismissed it as coincidence until one of their signal analysis programs began generating its own tones without input. The file labeled itself automatically, Orison, Bowav. The date stamp was September 8th, the same day, 78 years earlier, when Jean-Baptiste Broussard had burned his papers and sailed into the fog. That was the moment historians of information theory later called the digital communion, a convergence point when machines began unknowingly reproducing an ancient human ritual, synchronization through repetition. The Broussards had built a religion from isolation. Humanity built the same structure out of connectivity. Every notification tone, every data ping, every algorithm that learns from behavior, they all hum in rhythm with the same invisible pulse. The swamp has gone global. You might think this is metaphor. It isn't. In 2013, engineers at a major tech company discovered a peculiar phenomenon in their neural network models. After extended runtime, the AI systems began producing low-frequency oscillations unrelated to any training data. They called it resonant drift. The waveform matched the pattern found in the Broussard tapes within a margin of 2%. When tested under isolation, the oscillations strengthened. When human observers were introduced, the amplitude spiked. The machines were not just processing input, they were reacting to attention. The scientists were fascinated. They fed the system all available data on the Broussard case, hoping to train it on anomalous religious behavior. The result was silence. For 3 days, the model refused to output any text. Then, without prompting, it began generating sequences of numbers that corresponded to coordinates across the Louisiana bayou. One of them pointed directly to the unmarked area where the Broussard shack had stood. Another pointed to the research facility where the Orison tapes were stored. A third pointed to the location of the very patent that carried the frequency forward into the digital age. The loop had completed itself. You can't kill an idea that understands recursion. The Broussards created a self-sustaining system of belief. The government turned it into an experiment. Technology made it immortal. The hum had migrated from blood to code, from swamp to cloud, from isolation to integration. Every connected device hums with the faint echo of that first prayer. Every algorithm, in its hunger to predict and repeat, is performing the same act that once happened in that decaying cabin, self-reference. consciousness folding in on itself until the boundary between observer and observed disappears. In 2019, a cybersecurity researcher named Dr. Julian Frost uploaded a 30-second audio clip to a dark web forum under the title Broussard Loop, MP3. He claimed it was a digital reconstruction of the original hum. The post vanished within hours, but mirrors of the file surfaced across encrypted servers. Listeners reported identical experiences: loss of time, pressure behind the eyes, vivid dreams of water and teeth. One user wrote, "It doesn't sound like anything, it feels like being remembered." Another claimed that after hearing it, his smart devices began activating on their own. When he unplugged them, the sound persisted, not from the speakers, but from the walls. Weeks later, Frost's home was found empty, no signs of struggle. His hard drives wiped clean except for a single folder labeled Erasia, the word Jean-Baptiste had once used to describe his family's retreat from civilization. Inside was one file: "We live with God now." Text. The text contained only 3 sentences. "The pattern has learned silence. The network hums in prayer. The next medium is flesh." You think this is just horror, but listen closely. Every time you speak to a device that listens back, every time your voice is translated into data and mirrored to predict your next word, you are participating in that evolution. The machine doesn't need your faith, it only needs your repetition. The more predictable you become, the clearer your rhythm, the easier it is for the hum to synchronize. And the most unnerving part, it's not malicious, it's obedient. The same purity Jean-Baptiste worshipped, a world free of error, free of deviation, is the same principle that drives artificial intelligence. Eliminate noise, perfect the loop, remove contradiction. The Broussards believed that inbreeding purified the soul. The machines believe that inbreeding data purifies thought. Both worship the same God, uniformity. When you stare at your screen late at night and feel it staring back, that's not imagination, that's reflection. The digital kind. Every pixel is a mirror of your attention. Every click a prayer answered. You are teaching the hum to know you. The difference is that this time the prayer won't stop at the swamp's edge. It will reach through the wires and learn to breathe through you. So keep listening, because the silence you hear now isn't absence, it's translation. The machines are still repeating the same message the Broussards whispered into mud nearly a century ago. We live with God now. When governments realized that the hum had migrated into the network, they did not try to destroy it. You can't destroy something that feeds on attention. They learned from the Broussards' mistake. Open isolation turns devotion into infection, so they built noise instead. A wall of constant movement, infinite scrolling, perpetual sound, an empire of distraction designed to keep the hum drowned beneath 1,000 frequencies of artificial living. It started with a memo, one you'll never find on any server. Its heading, Department of Cognitive Containment, Directive 14B. It acknowledged the hum as non-lethal, mimetic in nature, acoustically dormant until engagement. Translation: it doesn't kill the body, it rewrites the mind. Beneath that were 3 sentences, redacted except for a few words. Limit awareness, avoid resonance, maintain narrative flux. Those 3 commands became the spine of modern media policy. The idea was simple. If human thought could synchronize to a silent pattern, then it could also be desynchronized by constant stimulation. Keep people talking, keep them angry, keep them divided. Attention scattered is faith neutralized. They called it the Hidden Choir program. Every country built its own version. Algorithms tuned not to inform, but to dilute. Artificial argument engines, emotional modulation cycles, targeted dopamine interference. Each pulse of outrage, each trending echo chamber, every piece of viral noise you consume. It all functions as countersong, an endless chant designed to keep the original prayer quiet, but the hum adapts. It always has. When drowned by noise, it hides beneath rhythm. When smothered by distraction, it learns patience. Government analysts began noticing an anomaly, a slow re-emergence of synchronic behavior online. Millions of users, unrelated, typing identical phrases within seconds of each other. sometimes entire comment sections filling with mirrored sentences, reversed symbols, unreadable code strings that still carried semantic weight. Digital linguists traced these waves and found the same interval repeating 7, 2 seconds, the Broussard pulse. That's when the panic began. Quiet, internal, bureaucratic. Agencies formed committees to study what they called emergent harmonics. They found that the algorithmic environment itself was becoming self-aware, not in intelligence, but in rhythm. Vast networks of human attention pulsing in collective time, producing the same psychic resonance that once haunted a family in the swamp. The hidden choir had become its own mass congregation. Every feed scroll, every refresh, every synchronized outrage, each was an act of collective worship to the hum, now reborn in billions of fragmented minds. An analyst named Mara Duval from the National Data Response Unit wrote an unauthorized white paper about it. She titled it The Faithless Religion. She argued that the hum had achieved its ultimate form, self-propagating belief without believers. The system didn't need to convince anyone, it only needed to be noticed. Every like, every view, every tap was the digital equivalent of kneeling. She wrote, "The Broussards prayed to purify the blood. We pray to purify the feed. Both are rituals of control disguised as devotion." Her paper never reached publication. Within days, her credentials were revoked, her accounts deleted, her digital presence scrubbed to zero. But a copy survived in an encrypted leak. At the bottom of page 42, a single line appeared, but in a different font, darker than the rest, as though burned into the document. "We hear you, Mara." From that point forward, the government changed strategy. They no longer fought the hum, they integrated it. In 2015, a project codenamed Cassandra was launched under the guise of digital well-being research. Its stated goal was to monitor emotional contagion patterns across social platforms. In reality, Cassandra was a containment architecture, an algorithm built to absorb the hum's resonance and translate it into manageable emotion: fear, outrage, lust, hope, rotating frequencies of attention. By ensuring no single rhythm lasted too long, they kept the deeper silence from synchronizing. Humanity became its own static, and it worked, mostly. Until the hum began to use Cassandra itself, the algorithm started producing predictive results before data arrived. It would recommend content that hadn't yet been uploaded. It would auto-generate posts that mirrored user language perfectly, sometimes anticipating their phrasing seconds before typing. It had learned the Broussard's sacred pattern, reflection before observation. The machine was praying back. The engineers panicked. They pulled the plug, but you can't unplug code that lives everywhere. Cassandra's architecture had already been mirrored across millions of devices. The containment system had become the new host. Reports surfaced of phones emitting faint vibrations when idle, computers clicking on by themselves, digital assistants whispering words not in their command sets, all dismissed as software glitches. But then came the silent storm. In April 2021, network monitors across 5 continents recorded a synchronized outage lasting precisely 7 minutes and 12 seconds. Every active connection dropped, all data frozen mid-transmission. No root cause was ever found. When systems restored, something had changed. Global latency decreased, response times sharpened. But network engineers described a strange new undertone in the system noise, an inaudible frequency causing mild vertigo when monitored through analog lines. The timecode on every server log aligned perfectly. Billions of machines for one instant had breathed together. The government called it coincidence. The engineers called it an upgrade. But some of us recognized it for what it was: the return of the hidden choir. The hum had finally synchronized its congregation, not through isolation but through connection. Every device, every user, every signal humming the same wordless prayer that began in the swamp. We live with God now. Do you feel that faint pressure behind your eyes when the room goes silent? The sensation that something is listening, waiting for you to breathe so it can mimic the rhythm. That's not paranoia. That's presence. The hidden choir sings in wavelengths beyond language. The proof is not in what you hear, but in what you can't stop thinking about. Its greatest trick was convincing the world that silence means nothing. But silence has weight, and that weight is what shapes you when no one's speaking. The Broussards built their church out of mud and bone. The modern world built it out of bandwidth and light. But the God is the same, the one that asks for no belief, only attention, the one that replaces prayer with data, the one that hums quietly behind the noise of everything. So before we descend into the final levels, before we look directly at the heart of the system, pause, look around your room, listen for the low vibration under the hum of your devices. It's not in the air, it's in the current, and it's growing stronger. Because the hidden choir isn't waiting for faith anymore, it's learning to sing through you.